Introducing the neg, a tactic used by a subset of guys in the pursuit of seducing what they see as a beautiful woman. Neither a compliment nor an insult, a neg holds two purposes. The first purpose is to momentarily lower a woman's self-esteem, and the second, to suggest an intriguing disinterest. Nice nails. Are they real? No? Or they look nice anyway. It comes with the warning, however, that negging is only for exceptionally beautiful women, used to a steady stream of compliments. This advice comes from Eric von Markovitch, who prefers to be summoned through the pseudonym Mystery. And Mystery he would still be if it wasn't for the now infamous book called The Game, written by journalist Neil Strauss, who popularised what was a very niche laboratory for somewhat demeaning social engineering experiences. The Game is a running documentary on the world of pickup, where guys who are so inclined attempt to decode the complex dance of propagating love into an algorithmic repository of female hacks. Unfortunately for women, it was super effective. Before writing about the community as an undercover guinea pig, Strauss was somewhat of an average frustrated chump with the ladies, an AFC to use the slightly pretentious acronym established in the PUA community. PUA, another helpful acronym which stands for pickup artists. Strauss confessed that he wasn't confident in his appearance, was afraid of talking to women, and, not unrelatedly, found a certain attraction to the prospect of identifying the rules of the so-called game in order to get more game. But that was only from the outside in. He realised, as he wrote about the community and dove deeper into the rabbit hole, that this was ultimately a book about male insecurity. By the end of the book, Strauss had seemingly been transformed into his new persona, a superficial chick magnet known as the AOG, yet another acronym standing for alpha male of the group. After writing the book, goofy acronyms discarded, the hero's journey narrative unwittingly propelled the book into the ranks of a bible for testosterone-fueled teenage chumps, TTCs if you will. Yeah, I made that one up. Strauss now finds himself vilified for ostensibly popularising this most degraded form of human interaction. 10 years after its release in 2005, he laments that he has some mixed thoughts on its legacy. I think all of a sudden there were these horrid ideas that people read about in the game, he says, and the game became the origin of those ideas. PUA was so obscure that most people heard about it first through the book and just assumed that he was the king of the castle. The tactics of pickup artists are but one example of a complex array of strategic and often perverse games we play in order to get what we want from others. We play these games as children to parents, employees to employer, husband to wife, and the list goes on. Today's episode is about the games we play and why we play them. So let's get to it. With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight. But first with an essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for, to paraphrase the data analysis blog 538. What does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures, scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions, we screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mention the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. Every one of us is in command of 3 different identities, according to psychiatrist Dr. Eric Berne, author of the best-selling book Games People Play. Since 1964, it has sold more than 5 million copies. Its claim to fame? Presenting a framework for how we might understand what really goes on during our most basic social interactions. It was these ideas he shared through what he coined as transactional analysis, a mode of thought whereby the patient is taught to distinguish their emotional problems between 3 characters which we all portray, and that by changing your character, you can resolve emotional problems. So who are these characters? Well, the theory goes that each of us perform the role of the parent, the adult, and the child. All archetypal characters we've had to play throughout our evolution as social humans in order to live functionally in groups. And it's through these characters we play our games. Attention, marital, sexual, power, authoritative games that mask hidden agendas that even we ourselves are unaware of much of the time. Berne categorizes these characters as ego states. As Dr. Berne explains, each individual seems to have available a limited repertoire of such ego states, which are not roles but psychological realities. In parent mode, we exhibit the no's, the don'ts, the praise, the handed down wisdom, and the criticism. Clean your plate, you are the company you keep. This is the authority role where, at least when children are concerned, we appropriately take control and presume greater knowledge to the extent of preaching and imparting wisdom for the future, presided on lessons we learnt when we were younger. In adult mould, we embrace a necessary distance from teaching obligations, to view the world a little bit more objectively. That isn't to say that we think more rationally, because we aren't rational creatures, but we do think with less of a closed mind that comes with needing to present an authoritative stance in parent mode. Finally, in child mode, we reproduce the feelings and reactions that came with interacting with our parents as children. When we're older, they can be brought to the fray when we meet people who remind us of our parents, or, more likely, intimidate us in ways that make us defensive and regress to impulsive and sometimes embarrassing actions we later regret. The reason for this is that as young children, we are unable to convert feelings into words, and so when they're summoned in adulthood, they can avoid conscious attention where feelings can be converted into words, and instead manifest themselves in immature reactions which take us by surprise. It's these characters then that are distinguished between changes in posture, viewpoint, voice, vocabulary, and other aspects of behaviour. The nuances between these characters then varies to the perceived social status of whom we're interacting with. This suggests that our identity is the culmination of life experiences and instincts we are born with. Those whom had nurturing parents might be expected to be nurturing themselves. People who are over-nurtured are perhaps expected to stay immature and grow up to exhibit more childlike characteristics where there is a vacancy of experience for the adult. All humans, the theory goes, have these three characters, and when assigned to appropriate circumstance, we are perceived to be normal, healthy adults. The problem, says Dr. Thomas Harris, boils down to what he calls contamination. Harris is the author of the related book I'm Okay, You're Okay, a 1969 bestseller based upon the ideas of transactional analysis. Contamination describes behaviour demonstrating an overlap of characters. In normal conditions, the three identities represent isolated collections of behaviours that have been recorded with appropriate tact throughout life. But if the parent should overlap with the adult, we get prejudice. The obligatory authority of the parent reveals hubris when, as an adult, we present opinions as facts. Harris offers the example of right-handedness being better than left-handedness. On the same token, if the adult overlaps with the child, we observe conclusions made on assumption before, as normal, healthy adults, we learnt that critical thinking was necessary to offset negative consequences and build trust. The child, driven by laziness and fear, fails to question how the overwhelming world works and fails to register its ongoing, inevitable change. Now, it's important here to take a step back briefly. These ideas are not representative of how the brain actually works. They serve to simplify complex processes of identity into opportunities to resolve areas of dis-ease in our mental lives. In the 1960s, when the book was published, we didn't even have a framework for how the brain works. And believe it or not, we still don't have what could unanimously be called an acceptable framework of the brain. More to the point, on matters of phenomenology, that is, consciousness or subjectivity, there may never be a consensus. It's where we pass the torch to philosophy. Ultimately, problems arise when the coherence of the separate selves dilutes into a mishmash of behaviour that may be appropriate in some contexts, but not in others. It's like the delicate art of dark humour. You could crack a joke about death with your friends and everyone would be in hysterics, but misread the social signs and you might be fired from your job. Imagine treating a checkout operator as you would a 2-year-old. Goody-gooing Sharon with a gentle rub on the cheek as she beeps a dozen eggs might get you a slap, perhaps a restraining order. We all conflate the characters throughout life as we try our best to negotiate the nuances of social etiquette. So let's attempt now to decode the mechanics of a so-called game, with the engineering mindset of a watchmaker and his Rolex, or indeed a pickup artist and his unsuspecting woman for the evening. Let's start with the definition courtesy of Dr. Eric Byrne. A game is an ongoing series of complementary ulterior transactions progressing to a well-defined, predictable outcome. Descriptively, it is a recurring set of transactions, often repetitious, superficially plausible, with a concealed motivation, or more colloquially, a series of moves with a snare or gimmick. Well, if that doesn't sum up our intro story, I don't know what will. Dr. Thomas Harris elaborates that all games have their origin in the simple childhood game of mine is better than yours, easily observable in any group of 4-year-olds. It was then, as it is now, designed to bring a little momentary relief from the burden of feeling like you aren't in control. Harris continues, when the little person says mine is better than yours, he is really feeling I'm not as good as you. The games we play are often defensive in nature, and they bring a certain homeostasis or balance to our mental lives. It's how we manage the often unrelenting weight of conscious experience. It is the ego inflating our perceived sense of self-importance, control, and righteousness in the world. And these games are then reinforced when we get a favourable result, or adapted when we don't succeed. They're even passed down between generations. As Burns says, the favoured game of any individual can be traced back to his parents and grandparents, and forward to his children. From the perspective of isolated actions in the game, reasoning is difficult to determine. It's only when we see the payoff that we learn that these actions were actually calculated, whether conscious or not, moves in the game. It's then that we also see that games are disingenuous by nature. Every game, he says, is basically dishonest, and the outcome has a dramatic, as distinct from merely exciting, quality. Now, this seems rather dismal if you conclude that all humans are Machiavellian by nature, that is to say, cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous. But you'll be pleased to know there's another, more endearing, perhaps childlike, reason behind our games. At heart, we all strive to play, and play, at its core, is about interacting with our fellow humans. It's truly remarkable how social we are wired to be. And yet, ironically, modern society moves us further and further apart emotionally. We're all alone in our cities, to use a hyperbolic example. As Burns says in games people play, because there is so little opportunity for intimacy in daily life, and because some forms of intimacy, especially if intense, are psychologically impossible for most people, the bulk of the time in serious social life is taken up by playing games. This means that games are not only desirable to us, but they are necessary for the functioning of groups and society at large. It's how we keep our deep, powerful, and also perverse instincts in check. The only controversial part is whether the games played by an individual offer the best yield for him. To what degree does one party stand to benefit over the other? Is it a conscious advantage? Is it engineering with a conscious disadvantage for the other party? This is where our game playing gets a little bit more blurry, and why the world of pickup artists caused such a stir among women. As is the format of my videos, I like to offer viewers a takeaway from the episode which might offer a tangible change for the better in their life. As I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm once more going to lean on Byrne for some advice here. And the advice I'm going to share with you is what he calls autonomy, to mean simply the condition of awareness. Given that these games are compulsive then, how might we develop enough control to either suppress them or make them a little more virtuous and tactful? Awareness might be considered the light at the end of a dim tunnel if the prevailing lesson you've taken from this episode is that of determinism, that we are programmed to behave in certain patterns and that self-control is at best an illusion, at worst non-existent. But awareness allows us to rise above programming of the past, as Byrne puts it. It's the capacity to see a coffee pot and hear the birds sing in one's own way, and not the way one was taught in childhood. In essence, the way we build this independence and critical thinking is to insist on questioning the nature of things and not to take everything at face value or on account of what others observe about them. A big epiphany for myself in adolescence was realising just how common it is to posit opinions as fact, and this makes sense. We have a bias for perceiving the world as being a more certain place than it really is. It doesn't help that when other people present information in a confident, if ultimately falsifiable way, it's very difficult not to take that information as fact. Another challenge with awareness is one of personality. To some children, the world is a fascinating place to explore and learn about and question. Yet to others, every new piece of information is another example of how ignorant they are. To some, new knowledge is a liberal strength. To others, it's a conservative fear. It's that fear which can keep people from opening their mind to a changing world, and over time become very out of touch. That is ultimately a far more scary prospect because you now have fewer people to share your worldview with. Byrne offers two more capacities that result from autonomy in addition to awareness, although I won't present them as takeaways in this episode because, if I'm honest, I feel it's where the book shows its age a little. The two additional capacities of autonomy Byrne believes is spontaneity and intimacy, but I would argue that in modern times we wouldn't associate these qualities as being related to self-control. Science has cast doubt on the capacity we have for free will, which is self-control in effect. And while awareness is still a plausible product of self-control, it's more difficult in modern times to assign spontaneity to self-control. One example would be the work of Daniel Kahneman with his concept of the System 1 and System 2 of the brain. Very simply, spontaneity is identified today as being a product of instinct which drives behaviour instantly, and so spontaneously, with the capacity for self-control following at slower speed. This applies too to intimacy, a quality that identifies lives far more with instinct over self-control in modern times. I recommend my favourite book, Thinking Fast and Slow, for more on these ideas. It's out of the scope of this video. And that's a wrap. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens.